Hello and welcome to Dazzle Presents. It's time for whites to wake up or wake the F up. I'm Dr. Kathy Obear here with Dr. Dena Samuels. And we just want to thank Dazzle Presents as well as the Matrix Center for Advancing Social Equity and Inclusion, Abby Ferber, the owner here, Dwight, might be Donald. We are so excited to be here. Like everybody take a deep breath. Because as white people, when we start talking about race and racism, often we get afraid we're gonna get called racist. We might get afraid that people might call us out on our behavior. And Dena and I and Beth Yohe is gonna join us here in about 30 minutes. We want to have an authentic, real conversation, answering any of your questions. As we're coming here live from Denver, Colorado, the lands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute, the original custodians of these lands. And why don't you introduce yourself just for a bit, and I'll introduce myself, then I'll come back with another question. How's that?
Okay, great, thank you. Welcome everybody, and it's an honor to be here. Thank you, Kathy, for inviting me to be on this panel. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say and what Beth will say when she comes in a little bit. I also just want to mention that as of last night, there's a new policy in Denver that says that we have to wear the masks even on stage. So that's new. So we'll be trying to breathe and speak clearly, enunciating behind these masks. So hopefully you'll hear us well.
And I'm so grateful because driving in, the data that within the last 14 days in the US, the rise of reported cases of coronavirus is 47%. And we all know there's a disproportionate racist impact and class impact, particularly for Blacks, Latinos, Native American. And so as we're talking today about dismantling racism, dismantling white supremacy, climate, and culture, what's our role as whites to wake up, speak up, partner with people of color, indigenous folk? It's not only about the last month of protests and uprising, it's all at the same time, even though the news seems to be covering the pandemic more lately than anything about the protests and the anti-racism, anti-Black racism work that needs to be done.
Yeah, I would say, we're a month in from basically the beginning of this section or this time frame of the latest killings. I don't know how else to say that, right?
These latest assassinations.
Yeah. And so it's 1 month ago today that George Floyd was murdered. So, here we are in the midst of the pandemic and everything else, but you all know that. You know what we're suffering through right now, all of us. But again, as Kathy was saying, who's getting it first and worst? Who's going to be at the forefront in terms of being having to deal with that suffering even more so? I'll just mention a little bit about, to introduce myself a little bit. I was teaching at the University of Colorado down in Colorado Springs for about 20 years and teaching social justice studies and courses on racism and sexism and heterosexism, ageism, ableism, all the things. And was consulting on the side as well that whole time. And about 2 years ago, in fact, 2 years ago next week, I left my tenured position at the university to consult full-time. And so that's what I'm doing now and really enjoying it.
And thank you so much for joining us. I came a little late to the anti-racism, disrupting white supremacy movements. I started out in student affairs at universities, full-time consulting, but I was doing breadth of differences, privilege, marginalization. That's what this means, privilege, marginalization. Full breadth of differences, because as I look back, I realized as a female, sex at birth, and as a lesbian, I was wanting to change the world so I could fit in. And I mentioned racism, but it took me probably till about 20 years ago before I started even hearing the words white privilege and what are you doing as a white person to dismantle racism? And I'm like, well, I'm talking about it, but I hadn't done the inner self work. So today, we're really calling on whites to think about what you need to unlearn around internalized superiority and What do you need to learn so you're an effective partner with folks of color, with indigenous folk, to change in your communities, families, the organizations you're in, to really dismantle racism, particularly anti-Black racism in these times, so we can finally move the needle forward and just stop talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would say too that for those of you who don't know Dr. Obear, I mean, her work spans so much, you know, the breadth and the depth and the personal work. And I've been in some of your workshops along the way, and I'm just, they're always transformational. And so it's like I said, it's an honor. It's an honor to be here with you.
Well, in your work with the White Privilege Conference, with Dr. Eddie Moore Jr., the founder for 20 years, bringing people together to really look at privilege, but to do that internal healing work. And what I know growing up as a white person, I don't know about you, Dena, I wasn't paying attention to race. I was outside playing, and I'd watch the TV, and I'd see the civil rights dynamics in Birmingham, white people just terrorizing blacks with fire hoses and dogs. But at the time, I was, 10, 12? And I knew it was wrong, but here's how I made meaning. Those are the racists. Those are the KKK. Those are the white supremacists. I'm a good white. And I wish I could say quickly I shifted, but it was decades before I stopped distancing myself and saying, I'm not like Amy Cooper in Central Park, who weaponized the police to try to get Christian Cooper killed, African-American man who just asked her to follow the law. And I know that sense of entitlement and how dare you confront me and stay in your place. And feels yucky to admit it, but these beliefs that whites are better, superior, I think are just in literally our DNA. Mm-hmm. And it's a daily, moment by moment, to recognize racist dynamics in ourselves, how we perpetuate it, and engage other whites so that we call them in to look at their own behavior and then look at our systems, organizational. But I think the first work is self-work of when did you have racial socialization? When did you have racist attitudes? Mm-hmm. And that's what we can talk more about today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can share personally for me, I was born in Johannesburg, South Africa.
I didn't know that.
No? Okay. Well, there you go.
Wow.
Yeah, and so, but I didn't stay there long, but my parents, and my father was working for Smithsonian Institute, and so my family lived there for 6 years, and I was born sort of at the tail end of that. Then we moved to Ethiopia and then to the States. So, you know, I was a toddler by the time I came to the States, but my first interaction with, when I was born, there were people with very dark skin around me who treated me beautifully. I mean, really cared for me and gave me much, it's hard to say, but the people, I've had a lot of trauma in my life. I've been tortured, I've been traumatized, and all of that as a kid. But the people who traumatized me all had white skin. So, you know, people have always asked me, you know, why did you get involved in this? How, you know, why are you doing social justice work? I'm like, first of all, everyone should be, right? Especially white folks, right? That it's our problem. It's not, you know, it's definitely, you know, white supremacy and all of that, white supremacist ideology. We need to be, you know, we all need to be doing this work. So that's the answer to that question. But by the same token, for me personally, when I look at my own story, I had to go back and think about what, you know, really was at the heart of it. And I realized that I have much more trust now. And I have trust more for people with dark skin than people with white skin. And I think that's because of my, you know, personally, that's from my childhood. That's where I feel the safest.
So I'm still sitting with your story.
Yeah.
And you're having me remember, come on up, Beth Yohe.
Yeah, Dad.
Welcome.
Hi. Yeah, welcome.
That if I look back, I cannot think of, in 63 years, one negative interaction, disrespectful treatment from a person of color, whether it's Black, Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Indigenous, multiracial, biracial, Middle Eastern, North Africa. I can't think of one. And yet, when I'm walking down the streets of Denver, where I live up on Northfield, I can still have fear when I see a group of darker skinned Black male presenting people particularly. And so the messages of racist belief that people of color, violent, etc., are, I think, in our DNA, are literally in me, deep. And your point, you didn't have much time in either, was it South Africa, Johannesburg, or Ethiopia? And yet your parents, and so how much of what we learned and lived with are our parents and grandparents? I'll tell one quick story and then we'll bring Beth in. I don't believe there was any, I don't remember any racist comments or racist behavior in my household. And the place I lived in Prince George County was an all-white neighborhood, and the only black person I remember was a maid who worked 2 doors down. So I got very clear messages about the role of people of color, particularly black folks, as servants to white folks, which is, and when I was in grad school, I came home from grad school one vacation, all of a sudden my mother out of the blue was telling a racist joke. And what I now realize is she was probably telling, quote, racist jokes and making racist comments. I just wasn't aware enough to notice. So part of our role as whites and waking up, as we've started here, and we'll now bring Beth in, is reflecting and having conversations with other white people. What were our racialized socializations? And honestly, what were the racist messages and the ideas of who are whites and folks of color? To begin that conversation, not with blame, judgment, shame, but if we can't look at how we were raised and how those messages may still live in us, we won't be able to then go to some of those next steps of our racist behavior. Thank you for coming in. You just ran from another workshop. Yeah. Beth Yohe, welcome. Could you just introduce yourself a bit as director of the Conflict Center here in Denver?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me. And my name is Beth Yohe, and as Kathy said, I'm the executive director for the Conflict Center, which is a small nonprofit here in Denver. And I just finished up a virtual workshop that ended at noon. So a colleague had their car ready, and I jumped in, and they dropped me off, so I didn't have to worry about parking, and here I am. So.
Well, again, I'm grateful for both of you as we're here and Dazzle Presents. Beth, would you say a little bit about maybe your socialization, how you learned to be white, or just some of the dynamics of race and how, you know, whites are superior and people of color you were taught to be inferior, if you learned that?
Right. So I was thinking about that, and we certainly had these conversations before, so thinking about, my childhood. And I grew up in Texas in a city called Garland, which is in the metro area for Dallas. And I remember, the things that I remember are not talking explicitly about race in my family or, you know, in other spaces, but then having other messages, being at friends' houses, and a friend's mom, we were watching an Eddie Murphy movie or something, and making an Eddie Murphy movie, and the friend's mom making some comment about Eddie Murphy's skin tone, and that there must be some white in him somewhere, and some things like that that at the time, I was in elementary school, that I didn't have context for, and so I remember being sort of surprised and thinking, well, something seems wrong about what she said, but not knowing how to frame it, right? So there's several instances growing up in Texas where those kinds of things happened. And at the same time, so there was little pieces that are like, that doesn't seem right. I was one of those kids, like in middle school, I was writing poems about Ryan White, and he had HIV and AIDS and was discriminated against, and so I had this sense of like injustice, but didn't necessarily frame it in like, how am I living in the world and existing, and who are my friends, and what does my school look like? So it wasn't until college that I really looked back and realized things like, in all of my honors classes, there was one black kid, right? And I never really paid attention. Our school was very racially diverse, but they weren't in my classes, or who was involved in what kinds of things. I just didn't think about any of that, and didn't really see myself as white. So I thought, now I would say that growing up, elementary, middle, high school, I had like the inklings, the seeds of sort of the white savior thing, like, that's not right, and bad things happen to other people, and that shouldn't happen, but I didn't see myself anyway connected to it until college, and started to think more about even realizing like, oh, I'm white and that means something. There's a context to it. And that had something to do with the fact of what classes I was in, what my experiences were, all of that.
What I relate to is grew up believing as an individual, because I worked hard, they told me I was smart, that everything I got was because of my own work, and it was a shocking revelation. It took a while to realize how many doors were open for me. Because I was white, I was assumed to be smart, and the systems were so set up for me. But that, we'll talk about that in a bit. What I'd love to move to is why now? And Dena, the topic for this came from you, and I love it. Wake the F up. So, if you don't mind talking, why now do whites need to accelerate waking up and taking action? And yes, awareness, and we have some books we've written, those are important, but it's about informed, urgent change in partnership with folks of color, indigenous folks. So why now do whites have to wake the F up, everybody?
Yeah, love it. I love the question. I feel like if you're just waking up now, man, you are behind the curve, right? You are way too late already. Like you got, you got to catch up. I think about, the fact that folks of color, especially Black folks, have been, struggling with these issues for literally centuries. So this is not a new topic. And yet for some folks, it is almost a new topic, which is horrifying and sort of earth-shattering and heartbreaking all at the same time. So, if folks didn't wake up in 2014 from, with the Ferguson, what was going on in Ferguson.
The murder of Michael Brown.
Yeah, Michael Brown, and so many others, right? Like, and knowing that Black folks, like I was saying, have been doing this work. And there have been some white folks along the way and other folks of color along the way who have been doing some phenomenal work. So I don't want to minimize that either. But just to say that, if you're white and you didn't wake up in 2014 and you didn't wake up after the election, this is your chance, right? And I'm seeing that, right? That people are saying now. I've spoken to, the first thing I did a month ago after when the uprising with George Floyd and all of that, I started reaching out to my Black friends, just saying, how are you doing? How are you feeling? What's going on for you? And overwhelmingly what they were saying, especially about the protests, was that they were so amazed and encouraged by the fact that most of the protests were filled with white people. And that they couldn't believe it. They didn't even understand it. They never seen anything like it. And I understand, I get where those comments come from. But I do think this is the moment. If you haven't already gotten there, this is it. You need to wake the F up. Sorry, not sorry. It is what it is. Yeah.
As a white person, I know all of us have been doing anti-racism work, white on white development, white accountability spaces, weaving anti-racism into all kinds of ways of conflict management, teaching. And this time does feel different. I feel rage, anger at the persistent brutality by police and whites, and I see millions of whites across the country and the world showing up in different ways. We started a white accountability space online. I think we have over 1,300 people interested, about 100 come a couple times a week to really do the self-work, and I know of many other people doing similar things. And so I have some hope. And I also know what I'm like, and I think what other people in our privileged identities are. We show up when there's energy, when the news is focused, and then when things slow down, we can easily go back into the way it was. So part of Wake Up White Folk is how do we do this long-term and strategic? The other thing I'm aware of is this focus on anti-Black racism, which I did not hear. I've been doing this over 20 years. I've had racism for African Americans, Blacks, folks from the Caribbean or Black as one of many. And I really am being, not challenged, but stepping up to anti-Black racism while not losing racism for other folk and colonization, indigenous. And there is something about this country and anti-Black racism that we need to address in this moment. So Beth, what's your passion for this work, and how come you think whites need to wake up?
Well, I think it's interesting, to your point, Dena, like we can look back and say, well, if you didn't wake up then, and if you didn't, what? And at the same time, there's a part of me that's like, as more folks come in and say, hey, you're late, but we're glad you're here, right? So there's that piece too of continuing to, whatever that process was, right? Whatever reason why now versus others, that as white folks, right, that we continue to engage and welcome folks in their journey, so that the work will continue, right? That it will be sustained and, welcome, and we expect you to hang, right? This isn't a drop-in. We're in it for the long haul now. And I think that's one of the things that fuels me now differently than when I first really had those moments of waking up, if you will, in college and different things. That now what fuels me is that recognition that as a white person, I really see my responsibility to engage with other white people in meaningful ways, and to be the part of that welcoming and continuing to wake up together and struggle and all those things, so that we don't continue to harm people of color in the same way. It's not saying that it won't happen, because this is the society we live in, but so that we are more mindful of that, right? Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that really engages me right now is I see a lot of engagement in white folks and all these things, and then the way that some folks are engaging is white folks are engaging is they're so frustrated with other white people that, like, where have you been? That they engage in really hostile or angry or, kind of ways that, like, if you haven't been here before now, basically you shouldn't be here now, and I don't find that useful, right? Versus like, hey, you were late, but what can we do together now? And really, because to me, part of what white people do when they do that and they sort of show up in these ways is we still continue to reinforce the status quo when we do that, right? When we continue to have these hierarchies of, like, I'm the good white person showing up in a particular way, and I know about this better, and all those kinds of things. That's still maintaining a status quo instead of really breaking down of, okay, let's keep moving. What do we got to keep doing to keep moving? What are the conversations? What's the action? What do we do differently? So I don't know if that was your question, but that's where my passion is right now.
I love it. As I remember, and I think I'm not that unusual for a lot of white people, over my life, looking to people of color, indigenous folk, or a term I'm hearing recently, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. I add multiracial, biracial because of the invisibility often there. Looking like, teach me, and what do I do? And by the way, give me a pat on the back and tell me I'm a good one, because I relate to that either or. I'm either a good white or a bad white. As opposed to, we are all in this together. We need all of us, whether it's marching, whether it's systemic change work in your organization, whether you're supporting financially, we need us all doing this work. And some of my passion is I've watched colleagues of color, indigenous folks at deep, deep exhaustion, bone tired, before the pandemic and the disproportionate racist impact, and then with the uprising. And so part of my passion is, while some of us whites have been working and speaking up, we've not helped mobilize and empower and skill up millions of whites, because it's going to take us all partnering with people of color, indigenous folk, and following the leadership of, so we're not taking over and coming in as that white savior again. Didn't know if you had any thoughts on that, or if you wanted to go a different way.
Yeah, no, I actually want to talk a little bit about what Beth said, because I'm with both of you. I totally agree. We all are in this together. Like, we need everybody to be part of this. At the same time, and I know it's not helpful for white folks to hear, where the hell have you been? Sorry, my language, but really, that's what I was called Wake the F Up. Like, really, our language is
I'll be right
important.
behind you,
Right,
believe
right.
me.
So, I understand that that's not helpful, but at the same time, I can't ignore the frustration, the rage. As a white person, I'm not even talking about what it must feel like for a person of color, black person in particular right now, the rage that is going on underneath the surface or sometimes bubbles up to the surface, because how could it not, right? And so do you get what I'm like? It's both.
for
Like
sure. I don't
want to minimize that rage, because it's got to be there. Like we all need to be feeling rage right now at what's going on. We did not create the system that we live in, and yet we live in the system. It's in our DNA. It's in the air that we all breathe collectively. So, what are we going to do about it? We got to change it. We need to actually connect with the rage or anger or whatever emotions come up with this work. We can't minimize that. I think we need to go from there and then move forward and say what do we need to do.
Yeah, I totally hear you, and that's where I'm in the you're late, right? So we're still holding them accountable. And welcome, glad you're here now, right? Like the both and, so that we're holding accountable, like, and then able to have conversations about where what kept you, what were you, and that's part of our own unpacking of like how we can avoid, just not think about certain things or just avoid these larger issues as white folks, so.
And if I could just add one more thing too, from what you just said, it reminds me too that we can get as angry or frustrated as we might be. The reality is we know why people haven't shown up.
Oh yeah.
Right? That white folks in particular are taught not to notice racism. We're literally taught not to notice in this country. So the fact that we do, when anybody does notice it, it's like, that person, this white person actually noticed something. We are taught not to know. So I always get folks of color who say to me, like, how could you not know? And I'm like, right? But it's because I was taught not to pay attention. That's how it's been perpetuated. The white supremacy has been perpetuated.
Or if we do pay attention, then it's like taught to see everything as this like distinct, separate, right? That's an isolated incident.
Yeah.
That's not connected. That happened there at that one time. And then, that one's isolated. So we're also taught not to see any connection to them as well.
Because it's individual, conscious, implicit racist acts as opposed to a system. We have a question, and welcome. Hello.
Well, thank you. How are you, ladies?
We're good. So glad you're here.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me. I'm glad you guys are here. Or you ladies, I'm sorry. Ladies are here.
Folk, whatever.
Folk, yeah. I'm glad we're all here.
Yes, glad you're
we're
here.
So I wanted to reference something briefly, and then I'll get to the question.
Please.
Sure.
Okay. This is the real racial breakdown of people in charge of our institutions.
Oh, yeah.
The 10 richest Americans are 100% white. U.S. Congress is 90% white. U.S. governors, 96% white. Top military advisors, 100% white. The U.S. House Freedom Caucus, 99% white. People deciding what television shows we see, 93% white. People deciding what books we read, 90% white. People deciding which news is covered, 85% white. People deciding which music is produced, 95% white. People who directed the top 100 grossing films of all time worldwide, 95% white. Teachers, 82% white. Full-time college professors, 84% white. Owners of men's professional football teams, 97% white. So my question is, as we're building out this space, as we're building out this capacity, as we're building out this consciousness, as we're reconstructing, unlearning, positioning ourselves to kind of be a bit more ferocious and strategic, old white men run shit. Where do we create that space where there's an opportunity for us to think long term, right? Abroad, oftentimes when it comes to what they're building out related to their industry, industrially, they think 300 years ahead. I'm sure, however so many years ago, I don't call them supremacists. I call them colonizers, right? Because supremacy still gives you this impression that there's a superiority complex, which we know is inaccurate.
All right.
So with that, I'm sure colonizers way back when were strategic. They considered their intergenerational wealth and their great-grandchildren and trust funds and college being paid for. Where can we collectively and as a society with mostly older white men positioning themselves to have the foresight, to have the community, and to have the construct that a PTA meeting would have or a Rotary Club would have, as opposed to having an understanding that they're relinquishing their reins and they're relinquishing their wealth and now positioning a black person or an indigenous person or a brown person to ascertain something doesn't necessarily mean that they're crumbling or deteriorating their own wealth, but it's a different type of positioning for us all to be part of the economic fabric of America. So what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you so much. Great question. Well, first, I felt overwhelmed as you were reading. And I also felt, how in the world are we going to shift the rich, uber wealthy financial conglomerates? And what I also know is that when senior leaders, whether they're CEOs or they're presidents of organizations, presidents of universities, when they really get the business case, the leadership case of why we need to change, not just demographically, that's critical to change the racial demographics of our leaders, people elected, presidents, but also the culture and the climate and how we do business, and to understand that worldwide and here in the US, demographics have shifted. People are speaking up and speaking out. And so if you want to be financially viable moving forward, you need to change. Now, I don't know if that's naive, if someone is $35 billion every year, if they care. And there are enough of those folks. And yet I do know that there are corporations, there are institutions like hospitals, universities that have shifted not just the rhetoric, but how they do business to look at dismantling racism, changing their hiring practices so they don't privilege whites, and really doing development so folks have an anti-racist inclusion mentality and they change their practices and policies. So I don't know about the uber global system, which when I go there and think of conspiracies, I get pretty scared. But I do know at the smaller institutions of 100,000, 150,000, there is potential and things could change. And if we get enough people voted out and voted in November, unless I'm being naive that makes any difference. So I wish I had something better, but I'm feeling lots of fears. I hear you.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
From my perspective, I would say since money is the key, when we think about the United States, that it runs on money, to me is thinking about financial redistribution, financial redistribution. We are not on a level playing field by any stretch. In fact, I just heard a New York Times article this morning that said that we are, in terms of the wage gap from white earners to black earners, that we are the same, the difference is the same as it was back in the 1950s.
Let that sink in. Jeez.
Yeah, we have gotten nowhere. So thinking about what does that look like for our average person in terms of, in the United States, where they're spending their money, that, when we talk, and I'm sure we'll get to like specific actions you can take, just, figure out where your money's going and please put it towards Black, Indigenous, people of color, led, run, owned businesses, period. Like, that's what we need to be doing, right? We need to be supporting those kinds of businesses more so than anything else. Think about where you buy your clothes, where you buy whatever you buy. Think about who you're giving your money to, because it talks.
And those are individual actions. And can you imagine if high schoolers, college, folks like us organized our communities and educated so that it's more than just one person? It really is that grassroots organizing that has to be a critical part of systemic change, unless I'm being naive.
Yeah, I don't know that this really answers your question, but part of your question when you're framing it that struck me, if I understood what you were saying, is there's this piece, right? So you read this list, and for all of them, it wasn't, for most of them, it wasn't 100%, right? So there's a few folks of color, right, that then we use to say, what do you mean only white people are in charge? What about,
Check it off.
Right. And so but the system, and I think to your point, you were saying, but that doesn't really change the system, right? Like, so there's a few people strategically placed that gives the appearance of change, but the system itself hasn't, right? And that, when you really think about that, right, even the way that most companies and organizations talk, it's about, well, how do we change our hiring practices so that more folks of color or other, whatever their diversity they're focusing on are in, but that's it, right? It's not about, and then how do we completely restructure how we operate so that it actually is different, right? And those are huge pieces, right? Especially when we have so much of society, yeah, there's more people paying attention, but it's still very much in the like, oh, it's wrong to discriminate. We should hire more people of color, whatever. Like, that's the level of the conversation, which is very different than how do we completely reorganize or start from scratch. And that does bring a lot of fear and scare and all of those things. And for me, it just makes me feel overwhelmed because I run a little small nonprofit, right? So I know what it could look like there, but this idea of big companies, I mean, those are the things that we really have to grapple with on a different way. And at the same time, I think we're seeing people in power show up in ways that I never expected, right? NASCAR or, we'll see how it actually plays out, but the NFL saying, hey, we were wrong, right? Some things that I never thought I would see happen. So I think there are little pieces where maybe there is some space in there, but I appreciate you elevating the conversation to like, if we're really going to talk about this, we're talking about something much bigger.
Well, to the NFL point, someone said, commissioner apologized, but the owners have been silent.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, I'm watching you because so where is the real power? And can you imagine if all players said, we're not going to play for y'all, and the commissioner said, you're right, until the owners come together and we look at transformational systemic change for our hiring of all coaches, our training of coaches, and our practices for interrupting racism, because there's got to be racist interpersonal aggressions happening from fans, from all kinds of people. CEOs coming together, principals coming together, superintendents. So wherever you're listening from, what is your influence? How can you broaden to get more people like you there asking these questions about transformative culture change? Because we can hire all the folks of color that we'll let in, but if we've not changed the climate and culture, the racist harm is going to continue, and it's going to be a revolving door. Did you want in? And then we've got another question.
Yeah, I just want to add to that's so critical. I think, for me in the work that I do in terms of organizational change and looking at, how do we shift culture? That a lot of people are looking at diversity. They're looking at numbers, the recruitment piece, and they're not looking at the retention piece. And we're not going to, you hire a person of color or somebody from the LGBTQ communities or, somebody with a marginalized identity, and you think, woohoo, we're doing the right thing. Check the box. And they're not going to stay because everything that has to do with anything that has to do with diversity is going to go to them on their debt. We have a horribly failed system in that way. And so we need to be thinking about shifting culture from really, I hate to say top down, bottom up, but that's really what it is. Everybody needs to be involved in the cultural shift.
Thank you. We have another question from another lunch person. Hello.
Hi. I want to make one comment, and then I have a question. Having come into the business world when it was me and the guys, almost everywhere I went, one thing that made a huge difference is if there was more than one of us. If there were two women, it was a huge difference besides just me and the guys. If it was two women, everything shifted. And so I think that getting numbers in situations so that a black person or another person of color is not just one person by themselves, the pressure is just too much. But if you get a group of people, it just makes a huge difference. But my question is, it has seemed to me that the virus, the pandemic, has been so disruptive that it's a factor in allowing some of these things to happen. People are just, it's just disrupted so many things that I have felt that it helped. It's helped with this shift. And I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Great question.
Yeah, that is a good question. Like, has it? I know there's been people who have posited that one of the reasons we are seeing so much protest is that there's more people were paying more attention because they weren't distracted by other things. I don't know if that's true or not. I think there's probably a number of complicating factors. And I also don't want to diminish the amount of outrage and real groundswell of things have to change by saying, well, you know, people didn't have anything else to do, right? Which is kind of the undercurrent of what some of the critique has been. So I think it's probably more complicated than that. I do think that the pandemic has, in other ways, brought to the surface inequities that we knew existed, but we're seeing it play out in very stark ways, right? So we had that as a backdrop then when George Floyd was murdered. And maybe, I don't know for sure, but maybe there was some pieces of, making some connections that weren't there before in terms of the systems. And, I'm seeing that this virus is hitting certain communities, folks of color, brown folks, black folks in particular, and they're dying at higher rates, right? I'm seeing that, and I'm starting to make that connection to healthcare systems and other things, and I'm seeing how people are treating Asian Americans because this virus happened to come from China first. And so I do think, because we were having some of those conversations, right, and then the overlay, but I don't know for sure. I mean, there's so many, you're the sociologist, so you probably should be answering this question, but there's so many layers there that I think all of it probably contributes.
Yeah, I thank you for the question, because I think it's a good, it's sort of, I feel like there's been some rumblings, you know, of what's going on, and then all of a sudden the pandemic, you know, as you were saying, Beth, I feel like we're in a moment of evolution, and that's really how I like to think about it, and it's affected the entire planet. So, you know, I'm just going to be honest, I come from more of a spiritual philosophy in thinking about this. I am a sociologist and a social scientist and all that, but I do think about it as something is going on around the planet. Like this has never happened before. We are in a moment that we've never been before. So yeah, I do think that everybody's kind of, first of all, our cortisol levels have risen, right, across the planet. There's a little more stress, a little more anxiety in the air than there ever was. And, you know, people are more, we've got more depression, we've got more, like everything is just heightened right now. And I think that it's a moment that we could either be like, God, I can't wait till it's over, or we could say, okay, what do we do with this? What do we do in this moment to transform, to change, to create something new? I think it's going to take a lot of innovation, a lot of creativity, a lot of really hard thinking, and tremendous amount of listening to understand what kinds of change, the direction that we need to go in.
Think about the organization you're in, your community, your family, friend system, and how quickly you urgently made so many changes when you realized this pandemic could kill people you know, love. So in some ways, so many places turned on a dime, whether it's online teaching in K-12 and higher ed, or a wonderful restaurant here like Dazzle doing social distancing, even last night had to make some quick changes just now. Can you imagine if organizations and society and government would make those same commitments to say, this is the urgent need. We have the pandemic that's ongoing and we need to keep changing. And anti-Black racism and other forms of racism and oppression of Indigenous folks I've heard people call it a second pandemic. So can we change and mobilize as quickly and as focused? Because your question was so wonderful. When there's so much unknown, there is so much possibility. When we really have to come up with new ways so that literally people won't die in our workplaces, in our schools, in our community centers, then we have the urgency to be creative and think outside the box. So this is the time, I know we're all consulting with organizations, to really be partnering with folk of color, Indigenous folks, listening, asking questions, getting anybody, any of your stakeholders, anybody you've ever served, anybody ever involved, to say, where are the gaps? Because as you said, Beth, we're seeing the gaps in the pandemic and now with Uprising. Where are the gaps in our policies, our programs, our services, how we make decisions, and how can we, with a racial justice lens, anti-Black racism lens, fill that gap and really listening, collaboratively coming together. So the way we create change now could create our new way of engaging moving forward. We could create the future moment by moment starting now.
I love that frame of urgency, Kathy. Like, I hadn't thought about it in that way, laying that, like, we were in a space of urgency and people understood that in a different way, and how those things then interplay. Yeah.
Love it.
There was one other great point I wanted, unless you were coming in.
Nope.
You talked about, as someone kind of identified as female woman, that when you were the only one, you were like, well, but when there were two. So many organizations are doing strategic hiring. So just like not check the box, but if we're hiring more teachers, more faculty, we're bringing in a cohort of folks into this corporation, this nonprofit. And so looking at several positions and how do we have a racial lens so that we change our hiring practices to hire a more racially diverse, culturally competent pool, and then whatever we're hiring. And then intentional support onboarding development, while we're also doing changes, particularly of the white people, our attitudes, our behaviors, our implicit racist bias, our practices. So the idea of cohort hiring. The other thing I'll mention is many of you all have heard about, I mentioned white accountability groups. Many organizations have employee resource groups, affinity groups, either for all folk of color, Indigenous, and different racialized subgroups, because to come together to have a safe space to speak the truth about the racism they're experiencing in the organization community, the racism they're experiencing from people they work with, and then ideas for what needs to change, the sense of healing, empowerment, and then can be a major collective conversation with leaders and other white people to say, how do we create racial justice in this organization? But the amount of daily trauma that folks of color are experiencing, Indigenous folks, and the generational trauma that's getting reactivated in this moment, we need to pay a lot of attention to, and not from a deficit model like, oh, they need help. It's the experience of folks of color, Indigenous folks, is because of our white supremacist system, our daily racism that we've not been addressing. And organizations need to financially support space on work time for some of that coming together, healing, empowerment, leadership development work.
Love it.
Any other questions from YouTube or Facebook coming in?
We do have one.
Oh, we have one here.
One here. So we have one that came in online, and then
But you've been standing a while,
Yeah.
so why don't you go ahead and then we'll bring in that one.
Okay, thank you. In the conversations about this racism problem, a lot of attention is given to people at the top of the power structure. And I think one of the things that I notice is this tendency we have in our culture to concentrate on fixing the blame as opposed to fixing the problem. Doesn't really work in this instance, because it's not like so many of these people were concentrating on ways to be bad to select parts of our citizens. It's emerging that more and more of the problem is the people who make the decisions, who have power, are just indifferent. They just can't be persuaded to give enough of a damn to do something about the problem. I literally cannot understand why people get their heads into that kind of a place.
Great question. So I am that white person. One way we talked earlier about, instead of judging whites and attacking whites, like, where were you? I remember when I was not paying attention. I was a college administrator, not at all paying attention to dynamics race. I still have racist attitudes, but I had active racist attitudes towards the one black man that was on our team, and hardly ever talked to him. So talk with whites behind closed doors about him. So the first step for white people listening is, how are you just like the whites we're critiquing? When have you ever been, and when are you now? Because when I come from that space of relating in and seeing other white people like me, then I'm not doing what you're saying is the bad whites. It's actually, we all have racist attitudes, these white supremacist belief that whites are superior and better, and we deserve and we're entitled to everything we see. So if I can get honest about where those racist beliefs still are in me and how I react out of them, I can then engage leaders and find what's their self-interest. What do you care about? Is it the legacy you want to leave in this organization? Do you care about your children and grandchildren's future? Do you care about financial viability? What is your passion? And then I can help them see how anti-racism, creating true racial equity and other forms of social justice in every single organization, because that's the other thing you said. We tend to look up and see it's their fault, as opposed to, what groups am I a part of and how are we perpetuating as well? Because what I learned by my coach when I was playing in high school and college, let me be clear, I could not be on an athletic team today. But back in the 70s, they didn't have a lot of us female types that could play. But what I learned there is some of the deeper lessons. And so how can coaches, how can all kinds of social group leaders, how can every employer, everybody in your organization think about, it's my responsibility, my role?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Go ahead. You sure? Okay. I really, framing it in that way, in the sense of seeing ourselves in the people that we're judging, I think is really powerful. I think that when we can see, I mean, it's hard, you know, especially when we look up and say it's so-and-so's fault. We can actually see how that happened, right? Like, we can see exactly when, you know, so we may even be right about the blame, but that's not going to solve the problem, other than to maybe make sure you vote. Mm-hmm. But I was going to say that from a very personal level is to think about everybody goes through some sort of social identity development along the way, right? Like that we all do. And there are going to be some folks who have learned, you know, they've learned these racist ideologies that they have lived with, they've been enculturated with for their whole lives, and they may have those until the end of their lives, right? Like, they may never change.
My grandmother.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. And then there's a whole bunch of people, most people, who actually can practice empathy, learn empathy, and learn to think about shifting their perspective to see how someone else lives and how someone else might be suffering. And that empathy actually helps us to relate no matter who it is that we're talking to. So I mentioned before that, you know, I was born in South Africa, and that, you know, I'm more comfortable around black folks than I am around white folks. That is true for me, and others. There's other people other white folks I know who would say the same thing. But that doesn't mean that I don't have racist attitudes, and I don't, you know, I've been brought up in this culture. So of course it's in the air I breathe as well. And it wasn't until I mean, I was an adult and I was studying that I started to realize, oh, wait a minute, even though I'm Jewish and I'm bisexual, I still, I still have white privilege. Like no matter what else, other than I understood discrimination, I understood anti-Semitism very personally, but I didn't realize my own white privilege because, again, as I said before, we were taught not to know. We are taught not to know. So, once I started to learn this and then started to see it, I mean, it was sickening. It was sickening. I was embarrassed, lots of shame, guilt, the feeling of, this can't possibly be true. I mean, I went through all the things that, the standard textbook when white folks learn their privilege, like this is what you go through, what most folks go through. And, I was no different. And so, unlearning what I had learned, I think, is critically important, but being able, because I went through that process, like you're saying, Kathy, I can see it when I'm teaching, right? When I'm teaching other folks, whether it be in a corporation, an organization, or on a campus, I can tell exactly where they are based on what they say. I can say, oh, I know, I used to be, I don't necessarily say it out loud, but it helps me to put myself in my own journey and remember everybody's on a journey. Right? So blaming them or saying they're a terrible person it's not going to get me anywhere. It's not going to be effective. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I love it.
The other thing that struck me, because you started by saying, we're not talking about folks who, by and large, are doing it explicitly, right? Like I'm making a decision to harm people of color by not hiring or not doing. There are some people that do that, but for the most part, that's not what's happening. You're saying they're just kind of in the middle and maybe they just can't be bothered, right? That's sort of what we think of as neutral. But what I thought of is part of why I think that happens. One is if it doesn't impact us, we don't see it as an issue, right? The other reason is most people don't think of racism as something that's in a system, right? So they think, what do I need to do in my organization? We're not discriminating against. We don't stand for that here, right? And so that keeps, if we have that attitude, then we've done everything we need to do, right? We don't stand for it, and then we go about our business. So there's that piece, and then there's the very powerful, and the longer that I sort of focus on this and work with white folks and think about my own journey, the power of the colorblind ideology, I think, is really an important piece here, right? So for many white people, they are brought up believing that the way, and being taught often explicitly, that the way to not be racist is to not talk about race, right? So there are lots of people who really believe, I'm doing what's right because I'm not talking. What do you mean? I'm not talking about race. Everybody's welcome. I treat everyone the same. And that sets up this cycle, because if you can't talk about race, you can't talk about all the ways that actually isn't true. And then it's baked into so many systems and organizations, and then, it just perpetuates itself. And I think education system is a really good example of that. We see clear disparities in terms of discipline, in terms of who's in, quote, accelerated or honors classes, all of these things. But when we have a system that says we're not supposed to talk about race, then we can't name what is so clearly obvious in the classroom. We can't name what is so clearly obvious in test scores or in discipline reports. And education has done more to disaggregate and try to have that. But the teachers, who we know are primarily white, often still operate from this very clear, the way that can be a non-racist teacher is to never talk about race and to make clear to everyone that I don't think about race, right? That's how I'm going to be a good teacher. And I think that really is so powerful, and trying to undo that is very hard, because there's clear resistance. But but this is what you told me, society told me to do as a white person, and I think that really impedes a lot of real conversation.
That is so powerful. And what I know, I was trained to be a K-12 teacher, And I remember clearly, Eastern Shore of Maryland, along the wall of windows were 3 black young men in the 10th grade. And they never participated, they never spoke up. And I unconsciously was like, well, they're just not very competent, not very smart, and I did nothing. One of my early African-American man that I got to work with in some consulting work said to me, you either believe people of color are less than and deficient, or you believe the system perpetuates racism. And that's why we have the gaps we do. And I had to kind of shook me, because I didn't want to admit that I still had racist thoughts and still believed, and that today, even now, I can struggle over having racist thoughts. Mm-hmm. And so to your point, individual white, particularly white women teachers, in the classroom, if we still think it's all individual as opposed to what's in my curriculum, what's in the way I set up expectations. Just real quick, I've been consulting some presidents of colleges and universities, and lately I've been saying, here's what I would love you to do, is have a forum and say, I'm committed to having us eradicate racism. We're not sure how we're gonna do it, but that's where we're going. And so every single leader, I expect you within a week to get me several pages of what are some of the gaps you're seeing, and mobilize the folks in your division. Start the process of what are the gaps, what are the racist implications of our current practices and policies, and begin the conversation. How are you going to mobilize lots of people to plan and be skilled to move to dismantle the racist dynamics and create racial justice? I'm calling it a moonshot because it feels that huge at one level, and the people I talk to, their eyes get pretty big, but some are beginning to move in that direction. See, as leaders, they're talking about systems and the environment and transformational change, that then people will have to look at their individual behavior, their curriculum, how they work with parents and guardians. Everything needs to be analyzed, and there's got to be a lot of self-work for all of us whites. What are racist attitudes, our racist behaviors, without that shame, guilt, and blame, or just enough so we're motivated to keep working.
Yeah.
Anything else on this? Because we had one more question we know of.
Yeah, I just want to add about, Beth was talking about the notion of so-called color blindness. I don't see color. It's usually out of the mouths of a white person who says that, and many white teachers, as you mentioned. And the reality is we do see color. Even if you are medically colorblind, you still see shades of gray, right? So that doesn't even, we are not colorblind. And if I were, as a white person, to say, I don't see color, first of all, I'm lying, right? Who am I talking to say I don't see your color? It's usually a person of color, so clearly I'm not colorblind, right? Not to mention the fact that as a white person to say I don't see color means I don't have to see my own color. I don't have to see the way my whiteness has privileged me. Mm-hmm. And it is a lie, and it is a form of racism. And I do agree, Beth, that it is one of our biggest challenges. I got data to show it in national data that I created from my dissertation work. It is one of our biggest challenges, this notion of colorblindness. It's really problematic. And then to your point, Kathy, too, just thinking about, this idea of, it goes to the heart of the pain that I think we suffer in terms of seeing the system as it is and really waking up. The idea that that we're kind of in this malaise, and thinking about the pandemic and everything else shaking us up, really to some of the questions that have already been asked and that we've referred to. I keep coming back to the idea that there's so much pain, there's so much healing that needs to happen. And this, again, might be a moment where we can take it on. I've been doing so many webinars, been invited to do so many webinars around with HR folks around the country. And what I keep getting is, the biggest problem people in organizations, large corporations have, is they keep saying, I want everybody, top down, bottom up, in the organization to have some sort of implicit bias training. And I'm like, that's great. And if it's the head of the company or the corporation, I'm like, are you going to be there? Oh, well, it's just for my people. And I'm like,
paternalism.
no, it doesn't work that way. It just doesn't work that way. Thinking about we need it, especially, knowing what our biases are and all of that, not just knowing the biases, but also figuring out what you do with, how to minimize those biases. We need training. Just being nice in the world or thinking, race doesn't matter or I shouldn't need to talk about it or anything is not solving the problem. We need training. Whether it's me or any of us, right? We all do training. And there's plenty of other phenomenal trainers out there. But it is absolutely mandatory, and not just a trainer, a really good trainer who comes, who's had experience, who's comes well referred in some positive way. Yeah.
So agree, and training is not enough. Open forums and listening sessions, not
Yes.
enough. Another letter to your organization, another strategic plan. We need action. And so 2 other actions leaders need to be doing is gathering people. What are the expectations for change that we have? What do we expect all leaders to be doing differently? And all staff, managers, students, faculty, teachers. And if they don't, here are the consequences. So an accountability. That is part of the transformational culture change. We have a question from over here.
Well, building on this conversation, someone wrote that the root of racism is the belief that there is real, quote, real separation or duality. But that's not true. And the definition of love is seeing no real separation. Once separation is believed as real, it manifests in infinite ways of racism. Can anyone on the panel elaborate on this? And what I want to just add is that I think this conversation about colorblindedness, et cetera, misses the point, or separation. I think as white people, we try to say we're not different, we're not separate. But I think what we miss talking about is privilege and white supremacy and how that plays out. And I was just wondering if, building on the question from the contributor here, could you talk a little bit more about that difference when we're having these conversations about racism?
Well, the first thing, were you going in?
Go ahead.
First thing that came up to me was how white people dehumanized indigenous folks around the world, Africans, so that we could brutalize, terrorize in enslavement and genocide. And so the separations started early. Now, one could argue historically there were other ways that people were dehumanized in other ways. But I do believe in the 1600s, the racialization of that dehumanization, and whites are smarter, better, Christians are here to civilize, all those. So there's all this coming together, 1600s, that is so deep in us that white people today, when they see folk of color, indigenous folks, I think unconsciously, subconsciously, it's you are less than me. And to make this point, Tim Wise put this out a couple weeks ago and I came up short. And he said what he does, if you know Tim Wise speaking around a lot about anti-racism, he said, someone asked me, did Africans who are enslaved have the right to kill their people that enslaved them? And he said, when they first asked me, I paused. But then the person said, how about folks in sexual slavery who are being kidnapped in sexual slavery, brutalization, and terrorism? If it was your daughter, would you say to them, you have a right to kill your kidnappers and enslavers, right? So, and I may have just misused the word enslavement, but I know it's called sexual slavery. So when I read that, I paused too. Wow, killing all the white. But when it was sexual slavery, I was like, hell yeah. And so that was a moment to just ask yourself, are there people either by racialized identity, indigenous identity, and deep down, do you believe whites are superior, better, deserving more? And I think so many of us whites still struggle with that belief, and we may be healing and unlearning, but we're tired, stressed, not paying attention. Just last week, I made 2 racist behaviors that impacted 3 folks of color. And as I went back to clean them up, I felt guilty and embarrassed and didn't want to do it. But if I'm not paying attention, I notice that I get the names right of white people, but when it's folks of color, I don't pay as much attention. And another one I did, and you might say it's so small, but someone that I know, a Latina, who was my contact for a piece of work, did not include her in the email, and I put a different Latina's name who's not even associated with that organization in. And so while somebody might be listening, oh, that was an easy mistake. No, that is a pattern of not valuing people of color to the same way that I value whites, because I don't think I've ever done that to a white person. And so even if you take, quote, what you might call a small microaggression, the daily dynamics every time re-trigger, we don't belong, we're not valued, you think you're better, and the system is set up for you to advance.
Mm-hmm. And it's hard when it's, written, so I don't know all the context around the question. But I understand the instinct, right? That the answer, the antidote is love, or, let's see the ways we're together, and those things. And to your point, Paulette, when you frame the question, it misses the point, because even if we said, oh, we're all together, we're not separated, people are treated differently, right? Like, we aren't treated the same. We know that to be true, and you have to, in order to have that sort of belief system, you have to ignore all of that. So it's connected to the colorblind. I also think that it prefaces, and we see this a lot in, quote, diversity work, this idea of, we spend a lot of time of connecting and how are we all the same, right? So that we can see past our differences. How are we all the same? And to me, it's framed incorrectly, because I don't understand why someone only deserves respect if I can see some way I'm similar to them, right? As opposed to, what if we just learned to treat people in a certain way, regardless if we have whether we can find a single thing in common or not, right? Like, that's where often these calls of, we all bleed the same, or we all have one humanity, as a tool, I think, to try to get people to treat each other better. And I would love to just reframe it, like, what if someone is, I don't have a single thing, right? But because they are a person, they deserve to be treated with equity and respect and dignity and all those things. And I think it frames it different, right? So it takes us out of this belief of needing to have connection or see ourselves all as one or what have you. So that was my initial thought from that question, and I don't know if that was the intent, but that's where my brain went. So.
You got anything? And we have a new question too.
Sure. So what I would say in my mind is a both and, right? That we are again, coming from more of a spiritual philosophy, I think about the fact that we are all one. We are all humans, right? We are all human beings. We are all in my, the place that I come from, like where I think, how I think about it, is that we really are actually all energy, and it's positive, loving energy. Like, that's who we really are. That's, again, my own belief and how I engage with people. At the same time, we are still in these particular bodies, right, at this particular time frame. And so, I don't think it's an accident. Again, this is just my belief that I was put in this white skin, that to do the work that I do in social justice, that it's very purposeful that I'm doing it as a white person, right? It doesn't make me better, worse, or anything else. It's just that is my experience. And it's different from a person of color who has their own experience at this time, in this place. Again, as a sociologist, I think about the setting, the context of what we're talking about. So, who has access to these conversations? Who has the time in their schedule right now to be listening to us in this moment, right? There's some folks who are going to be more likely to have time to do that, and others who aren't. Like, that's not an accident either, right? That it is a both and. Like, when we talk about, that we're all love and we're all one, yes, but if we don't recognize the experiences that we're having, and that, the statistics show, we are what's called spiritual bypassing, which is just that. It's bypassing the realities, typically, of folks of color or other marginalized communities. And so I think that we need to be we need to be open to both ideas, quite honestly. Yeah.
And I come from love and compassion when I work with white people. They may not say it as I engage them all the time, but I love whites enough that I will hold up a mirror, that I'll relate in, but if you're not coming along, I will share, here's how I'm experiencing you, and here's the impact you're having, whether you know it or not. And so caring confrontation is from love and compassion. Welcome.
Thank you. So I have an instructor, a black instructor, who framed the idea of color blindness in a way that I think is really helpful. He talked about how like it ignores the things that they go through in everyday life that are really bad, but it also disregards their cultural heritage. And to be a black man in America, he was finding that it was very difficult to live along this color blindness because it basically ignored how he was raised.
Erased him.
It erased him, yeah. And so when talking about like how we relate to people and like understand their experiences, how can we as white people encourage empathy for experiences that we can't imagine and cultures that we've had very little formal introduction to?
For some of us, many of us. Great question. Empathy, understanding, learning, thinking it then leads to more anti-racist work. That means you want in?
You go.
I don't know yours.
Sorry.
I've been going first all the time because y'all seem to.
We're all, we're all like, oh. So I'll go really quickly. And that is to say that I feel like we're at a moment in technology, that we have access to so many resources. There are incredible documentaries and movies that show us other people's experiences all the time. And so we have access to that. We have access to resources. We have access to data like we've never had before, from the U.S. Department of Labor, those statistics, things like that, so we can actually see what's really going on rather than somebody else's perhaps biased view of that data. We can go and look it up ourselves, right? The other thing is getting involved, right? It's a little more challenging now given COVID and the fact that we're not congregating, but I always invite folks to think about where in their lives can they, where can you go? What kinds of organizations? How do you get involved with local community? Are you going to the community conversations around policing or around healthcare or around, any of those kinds of conversations that are really available. Now they're available online, you can go through with these Zoom chats and things like that, but getting involved in that way, you immediately hear people's experiences. And if that's new to you, then it's a great place to go to actually learn more. And my recommendation, if you are going, especially for the first time, that you listen. And please don't, not that I want to silence anybody, but that just please do more listening than speaking in those scenarios.
And no white-splaining.
Yeah.
I can go.
Yeah, I'm still thinking, so.
The question that comes up in me is, what opens your heart? And so for some folks, it's statistics. For some folks, it's one-on-one conversations. I know for me, watching historical movies to get real documentaries, or for some, for whatever reason, it's movies for me, and to really just get in them, and then the outrage of the injustice. But a question I'm still sitting with is, why was it the murder and the assassination of George Floyd that was the final? And I wonder if it was because, is it Chauvin, that ex-police officer that is now arrested and I hope will be away for his entire life? The cold, arrogant, entitled stare for however many minutes at the camera. And I assume he was thinking, you can't effing touch me. There's nothing you can do. I can do whatever I want. I can kill this black man that I know, because they apparently work together in maybe an establishment like this. And so I keep asking, why was it that now so many whites are outraged and stepping up? And I think it's because they can't PLE it away, perfectly logical explanation away. Because it's like they just saw this assassination for 8 minutes and 49 seconds? 46, thank you. It felt longer. 46 seconds. But I want to ask, where were folks when Michael Brown was shot in the back from however many yards away, another assassin, and then just Sandra Brown, and we could just keep going, Breonna Taylor. So I don't know why this moment hit enough white people in the hearts that they'll move, but whatever it is that gets your heart open and keeps learning.
Just a quick, I think it's Sandra Bland.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
This is what we can do when we're in relationship with other white people, is accountability, correction, trust your heart, but you just misnamed, again, another woman of color, black woman.
And in that space of the why now and all those things, and where were people, I think there's lots of reasons why. And I think that perfectly logical explanation piece, for me, is a really key piece because of the length of time, because of how it plays out. It is very hard. I mean, we saw and the other ones, there was a lot of dialogue or debate about what really happened, right? Or it was quick, or there's a lot of action, or, there's these other things that people try to lay
Blaming
over
the
it.
victim.
Right. Or, they were afraid for their life. That's often what comes up for police officers, right? That's the, and we weren't, and the other ones you gave, examples of we didn't necessarily have video of, right? And the ones that we do have video of tended to be faster, like it happened more quickly. And this one, you can't lay any of those things on it, right? It's so clear and it's so long, and there's, and it's, so I think that's part of it. And then the story that I create from that is then people see that and it starts to unravel some of the PLEs that they had for other things, right? Like it's so clear here, I'm seeing this, and now I have to rethink, right? What I thought I understood or what I told myself to be true about these other situations. That's the story that I understand it to be. I don't know for sure. I think for every person it may be different, but we saw this in other parts of history as well, where video or film or TV or whatever has made a huge difference because people see it, and we know that that's a powerful thing. And there's also that frustration of, why do we need a video to believe, right? Why? What about all the times that this exact same thing happens and people tell us orally, this is what happened, this is what I saw, and then we retreat back to like, oh, I'm sure that's not what happened, or the explanations. And so I think that there's some complexity there.
Yeah. The other thing I'm reminded of, and then we have one more question coming in. When I work and do consulting in organizations, what I see white people, their hearts open when we can collect up real examples. I'm not asking people of color to teach in the workshop, but we collect up examples of those interpersonal aggression, those possibly not conscious, but just below the surface, racist implicit bias, the actions like on a search committee, well, we can't find any qualified ones, or they're not a good fit, or their research is a little outside, or they're a little too angry, what all the different coded racist ways and not so coded racist. And then people telling examples and stories, collect them up, generic them up so no one knows who, and then we read them aloud. And most white folks, when that happens, if they're still in denial at that individual and ready to explain away, when they hear literally 50 to 100 examples of racism in their organization and their community, most white people can no longer say, I didn't know and I didn't understand. And when they think, these were written by people I work with and care about. So why does it take that? I'm a practical person. I just want people to change. So that strategy can be really powerful to get more folks with that empathy, wanting to change. Was there another question?
I know Beth mentioned one that she has on the table,
Yeah.
and then I do have a couple more.
This came in a while ago, so apologies to Abby for the length of time it took us to get to yours, but it's a two-part question. How do you hold yourselves accountable now? How has your anti-racist actions changed over the past 4 months?
Great
Yeah,
questions.
it's good.
You'd think I was the one who got the question earlier, so you'd think I would have thought about the answer. But I was in the conversation, so go ahead.
All right. Tell me the first question again, because I thought about the second one.
How do you hold
Yeah,
yourself
how
accountable?
do you hold yourself accountable?
How do I hold
now?
myself? Okay, great question. That's such a great question for white folks anyway. Like, we all need that. So many ways. One of which is something that you can do this yourself. Like, it's copyable. What do you call that? Repeatable.
Yeah.
Is that I was invited several years ago, 3-4 years ago, I don't know how long we've been doing it now, to what we call WAG, White Women Accountability Group. And so it's a group of us who get together every month, and we talk about, and you gotta just bear with me, because when I say the struggles of doing white activism, I don't want to minimize, like, that's not saying anything, I'm not comparing it to anyone else's struggle or anything else, but it really is when you have been steeped in a culture of white supremacist ideology or colonized ideology. You can't always see what you can't see, like what you're doing. And so you run into trouble sometimes, and even doing it, each of us, we've all been doing this several decades, at this point. And we're going to make mistakes and all of that. And so having other folks who are doing the same kind of work is just critically important. I think that this work is so challenging to do with support. It's impossible to do alone. So I strongly encourage that. And then as far as, just having so many colleagues, wonderful colleagues that I can call up and say, hey, what do you think about this? Or how, whatever. We all have different resources. We all have, it's sort of like you can't, even as if you're a therapist, you can't necessarily always therapize yourself. You need other people. You need support. So that's the first thing. And then to answer the other question was, what was the other question again?
How have your actions changed?
Oh, have they
in the last
changed,
4
right?
months?
So, it's in two ways. One is that obviously in-person stuff has slowed down, right? I usually am traveling all over consulting, and so that's not happening. And what's increased is not only, so the work that I'm doing now is all online. My trainings are now all online. I've spent the last bunch of months actually putting them as self-paced courses that are all interactive and all of that online, not just the live classroom stuff, which I've been doing for years online. But so that's changed. And also the amount of calls I've been getting from friends, colleagues, and people I don't know saying, oh my gosh, what do I do now? And it's tremendous. It's a lot. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd say in terms of holding myself accountable, I think you're right, that is such an important question. And I try to do it in a number of ways. Similarly, having people that can talk to and, say, hey, let me run this by you, or this happened, or those kinds of things. Did that a couple months ago with Kathy with something that came up at work. I was like, okay, I just need to tell you the whole story so you can tell me like where I messed up and where I need to be held accountable. And so doing those sorts of things. And then I think it's important, I will name my intentions or the things that I say that I'm going to do so that then other people can call me out when I don't do it in different ways, whether that's social media or at work. We have a small staff. There's only 6 of us. But trying to be really intentional about, this is the work that we need to do. This is, how we're going to do it. So then other staff can be like, hey, that's not happening, or I think you need to look at this again, or those kinds of things. So thinking of the practices of where that can show up ongoing, organically. And then in the last 4 months, one area, I'd say at the core, my actions are similar to what they were before. And they've accelerated in some ways, right? So there's some things that we were already doing at work that were already part of our plans in terms of equity and inclusion with a race focus that were occurring, and we've accelerated it, right? And realized that have a different sense of urgency, which I think is important to pay attention to in doing that. And then other pieces that I feel like are always important, like white accountability groups. I know, especially with Kathy, been doing a lot more of, right? So finding more spaces, because for all the reasons we've already talked about, whether it should have been this way or not, there are more requests for it and more needs for it. And so trying to meet those needs and support in different ways. So I think it's a continuum. And then continuing in my family, we talk about these issues we always have, but finding there's just other opportunities, right? To take my older daughter to protest or to engage differently and find ways, she's 13 now, so ways that she can engage on her own that have shown up in the last 4 months that didn't exist before. So taking advantage of the sea change and the shift. So.
I love these questions. 2 days after George Floyd was murdered, a colleague, Rachel Forrester, sent me a note and said, I want to do a white accountability group, will you do it? And my first thought was, I've never done something online. And then I'm just like, yes. So how am I different today? I'm saying yes. So when people call, ask me to be on panels, ask us to come to Dazzle, it's like, how can we make this happen? Because I feel a deep responsibility to take all that's been given to me, all I've been learning. So many folks of color have been incredibly gracious as mentors, colleagues, nudgers, some white mentor. So this is the moment. So we've now done a month of white accountability groups twice a week, and then we do a convening one on Wednesdays. And that's one way I'm doing accountability, is that I'm not just getting on and saying, so this is how you convene. It's like, Beth, you were there yesterday. We have 5 or 6 co-conveners, and if you want to come on, we'd love you. Mm-hmm. And so we collectively just share ideas like we're doing here. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't, but we have lots of different perspectives. So I'm learning and growing from other whites in new ways than I was before. And on my website, drkathyobear.com/resources, we've put up everything we're doing in the White Accountability Group. Mm-hmm. All of the activities, the outlines, all of the chats, we redact everybody's name. So that if folks, because we've done 8 or 9 now, so if folks want to start their own white accountability group, they can come together with us convening and learn how to do it somewhat. But then everything is there that we're doing, plus many of my resources when I've taught that course. Because that's accountability for me. Putting out, so whites, but particularly folk of color, indigenous folks, it's accessible. And then if there's feedback, I listen deeply. There hasn't been yet, but there might be now after this. To say, this is what you're not doing. So I'm like transparent, out there, saying yes, much more out on social media. And I was out before, but more, I just feel a compelled urgency to show up every moment I can and then take enough of a break so that I don't burn out.
Yeah, I think that's a good point in the urgency and showing up transparent. And it made me think of social media, because that is an area where I have in the past tried to engage folks who identify as white or who are white around things that they say or comments and try to relate into them and engage in a different way, which is not the culture of social media typically. And during the last couple months have seen a lot of posts that are, and everybody's going to show up differently, but other white folks basically saying, like, if you are racist or if you don't, hold my values, I'm unfriending you. And I have, as I've said before, it's connected, have some problems with that. I don't think we're actually doing anything when we do that as white folks to other white folks. When we unfriend, it's really easy. It feels good. It's righteous anger and all those things, but we've just left that person and not really done the harder work of engaging and trying to make some change. And everybody's going to make their own choices, and some of it has to do with your relationships and safety and those kinds of things. But in general, I think it's just easier just to unfriend than to actually engage. So I've tried even more intentionally to engage online in those ways, to do the things that we've already talked about. I understand where you're coming from. I felt that same way. I see where you are. Can I offer something different? Can we engage? which is an interesting pace because even in a space, people often react out of anger because of defensiveness, but also because of that space, and there's sort of an assumption that, oh, you must be attacking me. And I'm like, actually, no, I'm really, honestly not. And how do we shift that frame? And so trying to be more authentic in that way and engaging in that way.
And the last thought on this is I have just been graced with some colleagues and friends of color, and we created the Social Justice Training Institute 20 years ago, and then we've been adding more and more staff and faculty. Beth's one of the faculty now. And so being in conversation cross-race as we're doing anti-racism work through that organization, as well as I'm sharing what I'm doing, that there's a relationship where I then can say, here's what I'm doing, and do you have any feedback? So that I'm not just off white savior and do it myself, but it's in partnership or at least with conversations with folks of color, indigenous folks.
And can I just say, yep. SJTI, so Social Justice Training Institute, I mean, it's funny, I meet people all over in this work, all over the country, who have taken one of your institutes, and I said the word transformative before. I'm going to repeat it because that's really where it is. People who I just met, and they'll be like, oh yeah, I did a SJTI, training or whatever. And I'm like, I can see it. Like I can see how they're interacting, how they're, it's incredible. So just a little plug.
I'm transformed from the work there, particularly my colleagues of color staying with me with grace, and then the white colleagues continuing to nudge. We had a couple more questions?
Yeah, 2 more questions. One, kind of following back up on the conversation about the execution of George Floyd. One question, and the response that's happened nationwide. One question was wondering whether white complicity in the maintenance of the U.S. economic system, which produces so much insecurity for so many, is being appropriately and sufficiently critiqued by white people. Your thoughts? I can restate that if that would be helpful.
Well, the short answer is no. We're not paying enough attention.
If you could,
Sure. The question was, do you think that the white complicity in the maintenance of the U.S. economic system, which produces so much insecurity for so many, is being appropriately and sufficiently critiqued by whites?
Oh, I got you. Okay. Yeah. No. No. Absolutely not. I was talking about the financial redistribution before. We really need to be talking about reparations, primarily for Black folks, but also there's lots of reparations that really need to happen for other people of color. And we're indigenous folks as well. And we are, that conversation is not getting where it needs to be. I will say that I'm really excited about that there's a new 501c3 here in Denver that's looking at slavery, reparations for slavery, which is it's just something near and dear to my heart. And so that's actually that this is a new endeavor, and it's a panel of Black folks who are running it, who are deciding where to put any funds that come in. And they're running through the Denver Foundation. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you can go to the Denver Foundation's website and learn more. Mm-hmm.
Beyond the no, I don't have, I think you covered it, Dena. And we could have a whole different panel just on that and the intersections, right? And Kathy already mentioned the deep history of how the country was formed around a racist ideology, which is absolutely connected to the industry, right, and capitalism, and they are so entwined together. It's deep. To ask people to look at that. And I think, like some of the other ideologies that we have in this country, very difficult and painful when you begin to unravel some of those things that you believe to be true or to understand, and that hard work of doing that. So no, I don't think we're addressing that in any sufficient sort of way.
If we think it's hard to ask white people to look at and dismantle racism, asking white people to look at classism and dismantle that, I'm not saying one's worse than the other. What I'm saying is so many whites are so rooted in class privilege, classism, and at least if I'm poor white, I'm better than African Americans, Indigenous, Latinx. So they're intertwined so much, and you can go back to how slave patrols were created to try to separate whites who had very little income and were being exploited by rich whites from enslaved Africans, so that at least you're not black. That was intentional. And so I would suggest people do some studying about how classism has been used, how capitalism has been used, whether it's a GI Bill, whether it's who got Social Security, and how agricultural and people that did housekeeping. There's just so many ways that economic decisions were made to benefit whites and to disenfranchise folks of color and indigenous folks. I was with someone who's Native American yesterday, and we were in a similar conversation. It was a little more personal work, but she said, just give us our land back. And I get that on one level, and then if I go personal, I'm like, well, what does that mean for me? And I think that fear of what about me and my family comes up in us whites when we start talking about classism and economic fairness and equity. The other thing I'll say is I just know a little bit about 8 Can't Wait and defunding the police and demilitarizing the police. But as I hear people talking about, I wrote it down, revolutionizing, re-envisioning public safety. The resources that have been so invested in militarizing police that enforces racism and classism and capitalism, as we shift those to see what we really be doing to support the social welfare of all, that might be a piece of getting more money reinvested in working with people who are homeless, working with people with food insecurity, other kinds of housing insecurity, working with folks with mental health dynamics that they're experiencing. And so instead of militarizing and making it about police and violence and incarceration and private institutions that are making billions off of imprisonment, and it's going to take all of us asking these questions. And let me get honest, 3 weeks ago when I heard the term defunding the police, I was like, what? No, we can't, because I was about my own safety. And then I got online and I read, and within an hour I'm like, oh, of course. It makes so much sense to be as creative and innovative, to truly have equal justice, fairness, support, welfare, social welfare for all. So these are things that are beyond my capacity. I know enough to say yes and to speak about them in this way. But there are so many people daily living as well as in nonprofits and other organizations that really know how we could reshape this country so there is economic justice, racial justice, and other forms of justice. But we need all of us moving in. You had one more question.
Oh, can I?
Oh, and then we'll go here because we're about 10 minutes left.
Oh.
No, yeah.
Okay, we're good? Okay.
Anytime you want.
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention, back in the day, I don't know how long, it's been a decade or maybe not quite a decade, I learned from Dr. Heather Hackman, who's one of our colleagues, and she's a white woman who does amazing social justice work around the country and probably beyond at this point. And one of the things she taught me was, she said, as you're building, like I was consulting while I was teaching at the university, and she was like, as you're building your consulting, figure out what you can do. Just be creative. Think about what can you do that would level the playing field in any way. Like even if it's the smallest thing, think about whether it's giving fair wages, who you're hiring to be, on your team, all of those kinds of things. One of the things that came out of it was that I'd always wanted to do and was finally able to do this year is, and again, it's just a matter of thinking outside the box. And this is, I'm not trying to pat myself on the back. I'm saying we all need to be creative. And so here's one thing that I came up with, which other people are doing too, which is a financial redistribution policy. And so that when any of my clients can pay my standard fees, right, that I am investing 10% of those fees into BI, Black, Indigenous, POC-led, people of color led, or owned or operated organizations. That this is, to me, this is sort of figuring out, especially me as a white person doing social justice work around racism and I'm intersectional as well. I do all these other things as well, but just coming to this work as a white person, I felt like, okay, this is one small thing that I can do, and that there's so many more. And so just coming back to the idea of being creative, being innovative, really thinking outside the box of what the systems that we've been taught have taught us, and doing something different. Yeah.
Fabulous.
Okay,
Last
so
question.
I know this is only 8 minutes left, so maybe this could be built in as both a wrap-up as well as a final question. And the question is, why do we get so defensive when someone mentions that our behavior might have had a negative impact on them? And what is your specific process to respond effectively? And what I'm looking for is some concrete takeaways for people who've tuned in and listened for the last 2 hours, something they can take away specifically today as they go back out into the world and interact with folks.
So in terms of the defensiveness, I mean, there's lots of reasons why people get defensive, but specifically if we're talking about white people in any way being called out for something that has a racist impact or behavior, some of it, I think, does go back to the way that we construct the idea of racism in our society, right? Which we talked a little bit about colorblind, but the other piece of that is that we're taught that racists are bad, right? That only bad people or people with ill will are racist, and good people aren't racist, right? So any sort of critique of behavior that then overlaps with this idea of racism, I think the defensiveness sometimes seems out of place because it really, for a lot of people, they take it in as you're saying that I'm a bad person. So there's that construct, right, that is really, that we're working with, right? And for many people, I think the idea of being called a racist is so, white folks, so huge in their mind, like it becomes worse than actually grappling with like the impact of racist behavior, right? Like you called me a racist. So I think that's one piece in terms of the defensiveness that comes up. And so one of the tools is to really focus specifically on behavior, right? So if I am called out on something that I did, if my response then is, but I'm not a racist, okay? So we're not talking about who you are as a person. I want to talk about what just happened and the impact that it had. So going back to specifically to the behavior and framing in that way is, I think, one way to address that. The other that I think of right away, and Kathy already talked about this, right? Engaging in and seeing myself coming from that place of, I know I did something similar, and I was really shook by the realization that I had done that and the impact that I had, and so I really feel you, and let's move from there. So those are two specific ways that I try to address that, recognizing that frame of one of the reasons why people get so defensive.
Great. Yeah. So I'm just going to jump to the second part of that because I love your answer for the first part. I would have said very similar stuff. So just for a concrete strategy, okay, and I actually talk about this in my book, The Mindfulness Effect, is this: what do you do when you are the perpetrator of a microaggression? And I always say, I expect to microaggress for the rest of my life, mostly because I have a commitment to putting myself in situations with cultures that are different from my own. I can't possibly know everything about every culture. Therefore, I'm going to make quote unquote mistakes. So how do I make a mistake and end up building relationships from it rather than causing a rift, which is what happens most of the time? And I'm not going to say that the shame and the blame and all of that stuff doesn't happen. It does. But how do you get through it? So I have a very quick mnemonic to remember what to do in the moment, and I call it mind the gap. So if you've ever been to London and seen the tubes, they talk about the gap mind the gap, they say, which is in the subway system, mind the space between yourself and the platform and the subway car, right? Mind the gap. So the mnemonic is, first of all, you mind the gap, you're mindful of the rift you just caused, right? So that's the first thing, is to be mindful, take a breath, breathe through that, right? Acknowledging what just happened. The gap is, the G is gratitude, because the person who you just microaggressed against could literally just have walked away and never told you, and now you're thanking them for sharing what they're feeling. Like, they could have just walked away, and instead they're engaging. So that's the G. The A is an apology, and not a long, oh, well, here's the reason I did it. Let me give you my whole backstory, and I didn't mean it, and da-da. Please don't say I didn't mean it. So the apology is very quick. I'm sorry I did this. The P is a promise or a pact that you're making, so that you say this out loud. The G, gratitude, thank you for sharing. The A is apology, I'm sorry. The P is a promise, I am learning, and I promise to do better next time. And then please continue to show up to build the relationship over and over again. No matter how much shame, whatever shame you're feeling, you can talk to your buddy about that later. In this moment, that's all you need, right? And then continue to show up again and again and again. Yeah.
And if you're not able to do those skills in the moment, take control of your brain. So sometimes I've had to say, I'm not a bad person. What can I learn here? Breathe. And then, as you said, commit to being better. And the other thing I'll do is ask, you may not want to, but I'm open to hearing the impact of my racist behavior. Mm-hmm. And I really commit to talking to other white people to learn and make a commitment to not doing it again. We want to thank you for joining us for these last 2 hours, and for Dazzle and for the Matrix Center. Thank you for your continuing hosting of these powerful conversations. To Dena Samuels, Beth Yohe, so grateful, and all the folks that supported us so that we could be here. And to you all for coming. And if you can just take 2-3 ideas that you thought of while you were listening, or an idea from us, and share it with 3 or 4 different white people. Do your part to create the change, and then look inside your organizations you're in, your families, your workplaces, religious, spiritual, wherever you are active. How can you speak up, show up, do more, accelerate, and help other white people learn and grow, so that together we can learn to partner with people of color for the leadership of BIPOC folk, Black, Indigenous people of color. This is the moment, this time is now. What can you do? Thank you all so much for joining.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Hope you all come back to Dazzle Presents.
Yeah.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
And thank you for our audience.
Yeah, thank you. Woo-hoo. Thank you for coming.